Hi, I'm Ian Evans. Thanks for joining us today on uh, this reading for all ages. I'm here with Felix. Say hi, Felix. And today we are going to be reading The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. We'll be doing one chapter a week, so I hope that you'll join us for the future installments. So get a seat, get comfortable. Chapter 1 The Decanter of Tokay. Lyra and her daemon moved through the darkening hall, taking care to keep to one side, out of sight of the kitchen. The three great tables that ran the length of the hall were laid already, the silver and glass catching what light there was, and the long benches were pulled out, ready for the guests. Portraits of former masters hung high in the gloom along the walls. Lyra reached the dais and looked back at the open kitchen door, and, seeing no one, stepped up beside the high table. The places here were laid with gold, not silver, and 14 seats were not oak benches, but mahogany chairs with velvet cushions. Lyra stopped beside the master's chair and flicked the biggest glass gently with her fingernail. The sound rang clearly through the hall. "You're not taking this seriously," whispered her daemon. "Behave yourself." Her daemon's name was Pantalaimon, and he was currently in the form of a moth, a dark brown one so as not to show up in the darkness of the hall. "They're making too much noise to hear from the kitchen," Lyra whispered back, "and the steward doesn't come in till the first bell. Stop fussing." But she put her palm with the ringing crystal anyway, and Pantalaimon fluttered ahead and through the slightly open door of the retiring room at the other end of the dais. After a moment he appeared again. "There's no one in there," he whispered, "but we must be quick." Crouching behind the high table, Lyra darted along through the door into the retiring room, where she stood up and looked around. The only light in here came from the fireplace, where a bright blaze of logs settled slightly as she looked, sending a fountain of sparks up into the chimney. She had lived most of her life in the college, but had never seen the retiring room before. Only scholars and their guests were allowed in here, and never females. Even the maidservants didn't clean in here. That was the butler's job alone. Pantalaimon settled on her shoulder. "Happy now? Can we go?" he whispered. "Don't be silly. I want to look around." It was a large room with an oval table of polished rosewood, on which stood various decanters and glasses, and a silver smoking stand with a rack of pipes. On a side nearby there was a little chafing dish and a basket of poppy heads. "They do well themselves, don't they, Pan?" she said under her breath. She sat in one of the green leather armchairs. It was so deep she found herself nearly lying down, but she sat up again and tucked her legs under her to look at the portraits on the walls. More old scholars, probably, robed, bearded, and gloomy. They stared out of the frames in solemn disapproval. "What do you think they're about?" Lyra said, or began to say, because before she'd finished the question she heard voices outside the door. "Behind the chair! Quick!" whispered Pantalaimon, and in a flash Lyra was out of the armchair and crouching behind it. It wasn't the best one for hiding. She'd chosen one in the very center of the room, and unless she kept very quiet... The door opened, and a light changed in the room. One of the incomers was carrying a lamp, which he put down on the sideboard, and Lyra could see his legs in their dark green trousers and shiny black shoes. It was a servant. Then a deep voice said, "Has Lord Asriel arrived yet?" It was the master. As Lyra held her breath, she saw the servant's daemon, a dog, like all servants' daemons, trot in and sat quietly at his feet. And then the master's feet became visible too, in the shabby black shoes he always wore. "No, master," said the butler. "No word from Aradoc, either." "I expect he'll be hungry when he arrives. Show him straight into the hall, will you?" Very good, master. And you've decanted some of the special Tokay for him. Yes, master. The 1898, as you ordered. His lordship is very partial to that, I remember. Good. Now leave me, please. Do you leave the lamp, master? Yes, leave that too. Look in during dinner and trim it, will you? The butler bowed slightly and turned to leave, his daemon trotting obediently after him. From her not much of a hiding place, Lyra watched as the master went to a large oak wardrobe in the corner of the room, took his gown from a hanger and put it laboriously on. The master had been a powerful man, but he was well over 70 now, and his movements were stiff and slow. The master's daemon had the form of a raven, as soon as his robe was on, she jumped down from the wardrobe and settled in her accustomed place on his right shoulder. Lyra could feel Pantalaimon bristling with anxiety, though he made no sound. For herself, she was pleasantly excited. The visitor mentioned by the master, Lord Asriel, was her uncle, a man whom she admired and feared greatly. He was said to be involved in high politics and secret exploration, in distant warfare, and she never knew when he was going to appear. He was fierce. If he caught her in here, she'd be severely punished, but she could put up with that. What she saw next, however, changed things completely. The master took from his pocket a folded paper, laid it on the table beside the wine. He took the stopper out of the mouth of the decanter, containing a rich golden wine, unfolded the paper, and poured a thin stream of white powder into the decanter before crumpling the paper and throwing it in the fire. Then he took a pencil from his pocket, stirred the wine until the powder had dissolved, and replaced the stopper. His daemon gave a brief squawk. Master replied in an undertone and looked around with his hooded, clouded eyes before leaving through the door he'd come in by. Lyra whispered, "Did you see that, Pan?" "Of course I did. Now hurry out before the steward comes." But as he spoke, there came the sound of a bell ringing once from the far end of the hall. "That's the steward's bell," said Lyra. "I thought we had more time than that." Pantalaimon fluttered swiftly to the hall door and swiftly back. "The steward's in there already," he said. "And if you can't get out the other door—" The other door, the one the master had entered and left by, opened onto the busy corridor between the library and the scholars' common room. At this time of day it was thronged with men pulling on their gowns for dinner, or hurrying to leave papers or briefcases in the common room before moving into the hall. Lyra had planned to leave the way she'd come, banking on another few minutes before the steward's bell rang. And if she hadn't seen the master tipping that powder into the wine, she might have risked the steward's anger, or hoped to avoid being noticed in the busy corridor. But she was confused, and that made her hesitate. Then she heard heavy footsteps on the dais. The steward was coming to make sure the retiring room was ready for the scholars' poppy and wine after dinner. Lyra darted to the oak wardrobe, opened it, and hid inside, pulling the door shut just as the steward entered. She had no fear for Pantalaimon. The room was somber-colored, and he could always creep under a chair. She heard the steward's heavy wheezing, and through the crack where the door hadn't quite shut, she saw him adjust the pipes in the rack by the smoking stand, and cast a glance over the decanters and glasses. Then he smoothed his hair over his ears with both palms, and said something to his daemon. He was a servant, so she was a dog, but a superior servant, so a superior dog. In fact, she had the form of a red setter. The daemon seemed suspicious, and cast around as if she had sensed an intruder, but didn't make for the wardrobe, to Lyra's intense relief. Lyra was afraid of the steward, who had twice beaten her. Lyra heard a tiny whisper. Obviously Pantalaimon had squeezed in beside her. "We're going to have to stay in here now. Why didn't you listen to me?" She didn't reply until the steward had left. It was his job to supervise the waiting at the high table. She could hear the scholars coming into the hall, the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet. "It's a good thing I didn't," she whispered back. "We wouldn't have seen the master put poison in the wine otherwise." "Pan, it was the Tokay he asked the butler about. They're going to kill Lord Asriel." "You don't know it's poison." "Of course it is." Don't you remember he made the butler leave the room before he did it? If it was innocent, it wouldn't have mattered the butler seeing. And I know there's something going on, something political. The servants have been talking about it for days. Pan, we could prevent a murder. I've never heard such nonsense, he said shortly. How do you think you're going to keep still for 4 hours in this poky wardrobe? Let me go look in the corridor. I'll tell you when it's clear. He fluttered from her shoulder, and she saw a little shadow appear in the crack of light. It's no good, Pan. I'm staying. There's another robe or something here. I'll put it on the floor and make myself comfortable. I've just got to see what they do. She had been crouching. She carefully stood up, feeling around for the clothes hanger in order to not make a noise, and found that the wardrobe was bigger than she thought. There were several academic robes and hoods, some with fur around them, most faced with silk. I wonder if these are the master's, she whispered. When he gets honorary degrees from other places, perhaps they give him fancy robes, and he keeps them here for dressing up. Pan, do you really think it's not poison in that wine? No, he said, I think it is, like you do. And I think it's none of our business, and I think it would be the silliest thing you've ever done in a lifetime of silly things to interfere. It's nothing to do with us. Don't be stupid, Lyra said. I can't sit here and watch them give him poison. Come somewhere else, then. You're a coward, Pan. Certainly I am. May I ask what you intend to do? Are you going to leap out and snatch the glass from his trembling fingers? What do you have in mind? I didn't have anything in mind, and well, you know it, she snapped quietly. But now I've seen what the master did. I haven't got any choice. You're supposed to know about conscience, aren't you? How can I go and sit in the library or someplace and twiddle my thumbs, knowing what's going to happen? I don't intend to do that, I promise you. This is what you wanted all the time, he said after a moment. You wanted to hide in here and watch. Why didn't I realize that before? All right, I do, she said. Everyone knows they get up to something secret. They have rituals or something, and I just want to know what it is. It's none of our business. They want to enjoy their little secrets, and you should just feel superior and let them get on with it. Hiding and spying is for silly children. Exactly what I knew you'd say. Now stop nagging. The two of them sat in silence for a while, Lyra uncomfortable on the hard floor of the wardrobe, and Pantalaimon self-righteously twitching his temporary antenna on one of the robes. Lyra felt a mixture of thoughts, contending in her head, and she would have liked nothing better than to share them with her daemon. But she was proud, too. Perhaps she should try to clear them up without his help. Her main thought was anxiety, and it wasn't for herself. She'd been in trouble often enough to be used to it. This time she felt anxious about Lord Asriel, and about what all this meant. It wasn't often that he visited the college, and the fact that it was at this time of high political tension meant that he hadn't come simply to eat and drink and smoke with a few old friends. She knew that both Lord Asriel and the Master were members of the Cabinet Council, the Prime Minister's special advisory body, so it might have been something to do with that. The meeting of the Cabinet Council were held in the palace, not the retiring room of Jordan College. And then there was the rumor that had been keeping the college servants whispering for days. It was said that the Tartars had invaded Muscovy and were surging north to St. Petersburg, from where they would be able to dominate the Baltic Sea and eventually overcome the entire west of Europe. And Lord Asriel had been in the far north, in which she'd seen him last, and he was preparing an expedition to Lapland. Pan, she whispered. Yes? Do you think there will be a war? Not yet. Lord Asriel wouldn't be dining here if it was going to break out in the next week or so. That's what I thought. But later? Shh, someone's coming. She sat up and put her eye to the crack of the door. It was the butler coming to trim the lamp as the master had ordered him to. The common room and the library were lit by an amberic power, but the scholars preferred the older, softer naphtha lamps of the retiring room. They wouldn't change that in the master's lifetime. The butler trimmed the wick and put another log on the fire, and then listened carefully at the hall door before helping himself to a handful of leaf from the smoking stand. He had hardly replaced the lid when the handle of the other door turned, making him jump nervously. Lyra tried not to laugh. The butler hastily stuffed the leaf into his pocket and turned to face the incomer. "Lord Asriel," he said, and a shiver of cold surprise ran down Lyra's back. She couldn't see him from where she was, and she tried to smother the urge to move and look. "Good evening, Wren," said Lord Asriel. Lyra always heard that harsh voice with a mixture of pleasure and apprehension. "I arrived too late to dine. I'll wait in here." The butler looked uncomfortable. Guests entered the retiring room at the master's invitation only, and Lord Asriel knew that. But the butler also saw Lord Asriel looking pointedly at the bulge in his pocket and decided not to protest. "Shall I let the master know you have arrived, my lord?" "No harm in that. You might bring me some coffee." "Very good, my lord." The butler bowed and hastened out, his demon trotting submissively at his heels. Lyra's uncle moved across the fire and stretched his arms high above his head, yawning like a lion. He was wearing traveling clothes. Lyra was reminded, as she always was, when she saw him again, of how much he frightened her. There was no question now of creeping out unnoticed. She'd have to sit tight and hope. Lord Asriel's demon, a snow leopard, stood behind him. "Are you going to show the projections in here?" she said quietly. "Yes, it'll create less fuss than moving the lecture to the theater. They'll want to see the specimens, too. I'll send for the porter in a minute. This is a bad time, Maria." "You should rest." He stretched out one of the armchairs so that Lyra could no longer see his face. Yes, I should also change my clothes. There's probably some ancient etiquette that allows them to fine me dozen bottles for coming in here dressed improperly. I should sleep for 3 days. But fact remains that there was a knock. The butler came in with a silver tray bearing a coffee pot and a cup. "Thank you, Wren," said Lord Asriel. "Is that the Tokay I can see on the table?" "The master ordered it decanted especially for you, my lord," said the butler. "There are only 3 dozen bottles left of the 98. "All good things pass away. Leave me the tray here beside me. Oh, ask the porter to send up 2 cases I left in the lodge, would you?" "Here, my lord?" "Yes, here, man. And I need my screen and a projecting lantern here, also. Also now." The butler could hardly prevent himself from opening up his mouth in surprise, but managed to suppress the questions, or the protest. "Wren, you're forgetting your place," said Lord Asriel. "Don't question me. Just do as I tell you." "Very good, my lord," said the butler. "If I may suggest it, I should perhaps let Mr. Cawson know what you're planning, or else he'll be somewhat taken aback, if you see what I mean." "Yes, tell him then." Mr. Cawson was the steward. There was an old and well-established rivalry between him and the butler. The steward was the superior, but the butler had more opportunities to ingratiate himself with the scholars, and made full use of them. He would be delighted to have this chance of showing the steward that he knew more about what was going on in the retiring room. He bowed and left. Lyra watched as her uncle poured a cup of coffee, drained it at once, and poured another before sipping it more slowly. She was agog. Cases of specimens? A projecting lantern? What did he have to show the scholars that was so urgent and important? Then Lord Asriel stood up and turned away from the fire. She saw him fully and marveled at the contrast he made to the plump butler, the stooped and languid scholars. Lord Asriel was a tall man with powerful shoulders, a fierce dark face and eyes that seemed to flash and glitter with savage laughter. It was a face to be dominated by or to fight, never to face or patronize or pity. All his movements were large and perfectly balanced, like those of a wild animal, and when he appeared in a room like this, he seemed a wild animal held in a cage too small. At the moment his expression was distant and preoccupied. His daemon came close and leaned her head on his waist, and he looked down at her unfathomably before turning away and walking to the table. Lyra suddenly felt her stomach lurch, for Lord Asriel had taken the stopper from the decanter of Tokay and was pouring a glass. "No!" The quiet cry came before she could hold it back. Lord Asriel heard and turned at once. "Who's there?" She couldn't help herself. She stumbled out of the wardrobe and scrambled up to snatch the glass from his hand. The wine flew out, splashing at the edge of the table and the carpet, and the glass fell and smashed. He seized her wrist and twisted hard. "Lyra, what the hell are you doing?" "Let go of me and I'll tell you." "I'll break your arm first. How dare you come in here?" "I just saved your life." They were still for a moment. The girl twisted in pain, but grimacing to prevent herself from crying out louder. The man bent over her, frowning like thunder. "What did you say?" he said more quietly. "That wine was poisoned," she muttered between clenched teeth. "I saw the master put some powder in it." He let go. She sank to the floor and Pantalaimon fluttered anxiously to her shoulder. Her uncle looked down with restrained fury, and she didn't dare meet his eyes. "I came in just to see what the room was like," she said. "I knew I shouldn't have, but I was going to go out before anyone came in, except I heard the master coming in and got trapped. The wardrobe was the only place to hide, and I saw him put the powder in the wine, and if I hadn't—" There was a knock. "That'll be the porter," said Lord Asriel. "Back in the wardrobe. If I hear the slightest noise, I'll make you wish you were dead." She darted back in there at once, and no sooner had she pulled the door shut than Lord Asriel called, "Come in." And as he said, it was the porter. "In here, my lord?" Lyra saw the old man doubtfully in the doorway, and behind him the corner of a large wooden box. "That's right, Shutter," said Lord Asriel. "Bring them in both, and put them down on the table." Lyra relaxed a little, and allowed herself to feel the pain in her shoulder and wrist. It might have been enough to make her cry, if she was the sort of girl who cried. Instead, she gritted her teeth and moved her arm gently until it felt looser. Then came a crash of glass and the glug of spilled liquid. "Damn you, Shutter, you careless old fool! Look what you've done!" Lyra could see just. Her uncle had managed to knock the decanter of Tokay off the table, and made it look as if the porter had done it. The old man put the box down carefully and began to apologize. "I'm truly sorry, my lord. I must have been closer than I thought. Get something to clean this mess up. Go on, before it soaks into the carpet." The porter hurried out. Lord Asriel moved closer to the wardrobe and spoke in an undertone. "Since you're in there, you can make yourself useful. Watch the master closely when he comes in. If you can tell me something interesting about him, I'll keep you from getting further into trouble you're already in. Understand?" "Yes, uncle." "Make a noise in there, and I won't help you. You're on your own." He moved away and stood with his back to the fire again, as the porter came back with a brush and a dustpan for the glass and bowl and cloth. "I can only say once again, my lord, I do most earnestly beg your pardon. I don't know what—"
"Just clean up the mess."
As the porter began to mop up the wine on the carpet, the butler knocked and came in with Lord Asriel's manservant, a man called Thorold. They were carrying between them a heavy case of polished wood with brass handles. They saw what the porter was doing and stopped dead.
"Yes, it was the Tokay," said Lord Asriel. "Too bad. Is that the lantern? Set it up by the wardrobe. Thorold, if you would. I'll have the screen on the other end."
Lyra realized she would be able to see the screen and whatever was on it through the crack in the door, and wondered whether her uncle had arranged it like that. Under the nose, the manservant maid unrolling the stiff linen and setting it up on its frame. She whispered, "See? It was worth coming, wasn't it?" "It might be," said Pantalaimon austerely, his tiny moth voice, "and it might not." Lord Asriel stood by the fire, sipping the last of the coffee and watching darkly as Thorold opened the case of the projecting lantern and uncapped the lens before checking the oil tank.
"There's plenty of oil, my lord," he said. "Shall I send for one of the technicians to operate it?" "No, I'll do it myself, thank you. Have they finished dinner yet, Wren?"
Very nearly, I think, my lord," replied the butler. "If I understand Mr. Cawson all right, the master and his guests won't be disposed to linger once they know you're here. Shall I take the coffee tray?"
"Take it and go."
"Very good, my lord." With a slight bow, the butler took the tray and left, and Thorold went with him. As soon as the door closed, Lord Asriel looked across the room, directly at the wardrobe. and Lyra felt the force of his glance almost as if it had physical form, as if it were an arrow or a spear. Then he looked away and spoke softly to his daemon. She came to sit calmly at his side, alert and elegant and dangerous, her tawny eyes surveying the room before turning, like his, to the door from the front hall as the handle turned. Lyra couldn't see the door, but she heard the intake of breath as the first man came in. "Master," said Lord Asriel, "yes, I'm back. Do bring in your guests. I've got something very interesting to show you." And that's chapter 1 of The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. I hope you'll join us next week, Felix and I, for chapter 2. Stay healthy and stay safe, and I'll see you soon.